That was that was the Run DMC's "The King of Rock" loose connection. I couldn't really think of a good song for King Solomon. We're going to be looking at King Solomon tonight. If you were with us last time, we began looking at the writings of King Solomon, or at least the writings attributed to King Solomon. But this is really the week that we hear from the king. That is, we're going to look at the Book of Proverbs tonight, and Proverbs is really King Solomon's book. I mean, it's the book that echoes the stories of King Solomon that we read in the Book of Kings, that describes him as the wisest of all kings, and says actually that he would give over Proverbs. Mashalim, the word mishlei, mashalim, the word, I would probably translate it as parables, or illustrations, examples. We can talk about that, but it's, it's the Book of Proverbs since the Greek, and it is as if, whereas the Song of Songs, which we read last week, it's attributed to Shlomo HaMelech, the King Solomon, and it is apparently a kind of earlier version of King Solomon, because it describes a king. There's a king in there, but it's not the King Solomon that we meet. It's some younger lover figure that we never really heard about. We do eventually hear about Solomon's love life, but it's not a singular romantic attraction, but rather he's loving everybody. But this is really like the King Solomon that this book in some ways reflects best the King Solomon that we know, and is dealing with this thing that King Solomon is known for, which is wisdom. Mishlei is really explicitly, it is all about wisdom. That is its central subject. And it is a book which celebrates wisdom, which loves wisdom. And maybe for that reason, it's also one of the rabbis of the Talmud, it's one of their favorite books. And if you go through Midrash, you'll notice there are certain books they quote from all the time, and Mishlei is one of them. Proverbs is one of them. More than the books of the prophets, they really loved this book, and part of it is because they saw themselves as the bearers of wisdom. And that was a value that they held, and so they looked especially to the Book of Proverbs. That's what it's about. That's what it celebrates. I will also say that the Book of Proverbs is not everybody's favorite. I actually have a very good friend who says, this is an interesting question. What is your least favorite book of the Bible? So he always says Proverbs, because it's so preachy. It's so kind of like self-assured. It's so, and it's kind of repetitive. It says the same things over and over again, right? And, in that sense, it also echoes the character of Solomon. There's something kind of overly self-assured about King Solomon, but we're really going to hear it on display tonight. I will say though that I love the Book of Proverbs, and I love it especially for our purposes. I love it especially for its poetry, because it is a distinctly poetic book, and we'll soon, I hope, see the rhythm. I want us to feel the rhythm of the Book of Proverbs, because it more, I think, than maybe any other book of poetry in the Hebrew Bible, it has a kind of rhythm to it. It has a kind of playful to it, which is identifiable. You can really hear it. There's something almost, I would say, Susian about it. There's like a like a da 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 da. Like you're gonna feel the rhythm, because the rhythm serves the purpose, which is that it is meant to be a series of kind of aphorisms, which have a kind of precise contained little, like each line is a little codex that you're meant to kind of turn around like a haiku or like a Zen koan, but the rhythm, it works to make it like a little box that you have to open and unpack. Okay, so that's just to give you a taste of where we're headed. But let's say a blessing to sanctify our learning tonight. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessing God for the Torah and for the Torah, and I guess I should say this as well, the Torah, which is also a source of wisdom, which is also our source of wisdom. And part of what this book is doing, I think, is merging the broad concept of chokhmah, wisdom, with the specific wisdom offered by the tradition. And we're just learning poetry tonight. But I am aware of like all of things happening in our world, in our country today. And I think this is we're not going to spend a lot of time focused on that, but I think it's a perfectly fitting a volume to turn to, because here we have a great king offering his thoughts on what it means to lead with wisdom, to live with wisdom. Okay, so let's dive in. Let's start to take a look, and I'm going to hand you or post you in the chat a source sheet here, and I'm going to take a look just at just to like kind of get a feel. The Book of Proverbs, as opposed to the Song of Songs, which is 12 chapters long, 11 chapters long. The Book of Proverbs is 31 chapters long. So there's a lot of, and as I said, hence the feeling of repetition. There's a lot of, that's 31 chapters with no real narrative, right? So there's a lot to do in the Book of Proverbs, and we're only going to be able to consider one of those 31 chapters. We're only going to get a taste of it tonight, but let's just start by familiarizing ourselves with some of the greatest hits of the book, and then we'll start reading the chapter that I've chosen. So the Book of Proverbs begins, just so that we remember the formula that we saw with the Song of Songs as well. Mishlei Shlomo ben David, Melech Israel, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And then in the second line, I just include the second line. Here's just so that you see how the Book of Proverbs presents itself as a king's wisdom. But the second line gives us a lot of the key words that we're going to be dealing with the entire book. What is the point of the Book of Proverbs? Ledat chokhmah umusar. These are maybe the two key words: learning wisdom and, well, how do we translate musar? The translation that Safaria had was discipline, and that's not a bad translation, though I would be open to other translations. We sometimes translate musar as ethics or instruction, but the word musar means a kind of turning away from, and therefore I think discipline is not a bad translation. But I guess we have to ask right away, if the two things that musar is concerned with are chokhmah, wisdom, and musar, discipline, then what is discipline in light of wisdom, right? Like how do we think about those two units as kind of as a pair? That you need chokhmah, you need wisdom, and you also need musar. And that formula gets repeated again and again. Shma b'ni et musar avicha v'al titosh et torata imecha. Listen, my child, to the discipline of your father, and don't leave aside the Torah of your mother. Okay, so there's like a realm of thinking, wisdom, cogitating, and then there's a realm of, I don't know, what is it? What is musar? Anyone want to offer a different translation of musar, or just to speak on what is all that discipline doing when the book is fundamentally about wisdom? Florine, you want to start us off?
I think that maybe musar could be seen in the light of character development. And if you see it in the light of character development, with all of its ramifications, ethics, etc., then wisdom is the first channel you have to go through in order to get there. But that doesn't mean exclusively that wisdom is only used for Musar.
Okay, that's good. That's helpful. Thorin gives us one framework for thinking about the word Musar refers to character development, to the development of the self, to a kind of a discipline that allows you to grow and develop and think about your own character, the development of your character. And to do that, you need wisdom. Wisdom has to inform that growth. Wisdom might inform other things, but you can see that wisdom is a kind of a like an intellectual, psychological, spiritual fuel for the practice of Musar, the practice of a kind of discipline of growth. All right, Michal.
I would say moral education. And I think having the word education in there is probably really useful because Musar has this implicit understanding that it is something that's ongoing and that's passed down, right? The wisdom tradition is about passing things from one generation to the next anyway. So I think including that word, education, it puts it into the context.
Wonderful.
Of wisdom.
So moral education is also a great translation, and I want to highlight another phrase that Michal offers, which is just the passing down of some kind of wisdom, a moral education which is informed by some tradition being passed down, and you will see that language all over the Book of Proverbs. In a sense, we've already seen it because it's King Solomon, the son of David. So there's already a lineage, a tradition, but you'll soon see that we're going to play with that dynamic of a passing down much more. Okay, now take a look here at, I want to just show you some of the classics. And so we're going to think a lot about wisdom. We're going to think a lot about discipline, chokhmah here in the Hebrew, umusar. What Proverbs is going to say about wisdom, that is, if Proverbs has a particular spin on wisdom, it's going to celebrate wisdom all over the place, up and down. But if Proverbs has a particular spin on wisdom, it is that wisdom starts with, there's a very famous phrase, Yirat Adonai, the fear of God, or, and I think it really is the best translation here, the awe of God. The awe of God. Okay. Now, interestingly, the most famous phrase for that, and here we can also think a little bit about the passing down of tradition, Reshit Chokhmah Yirat Adonai. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. Have you ever heard that? You've heard that, right? The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. That, though, is from the book of Psalms, not from the book of Proverbs. But take a look at the way the book of Proverbs uses the same sort of phrasing, but it's a little bit different. Instead of Reshit Chokhmah, it's Tchilat Chokhmah Yirat Adonai. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, and knowledge of holiness is understanding. So I just want to first of all keep that in our mix. Yirat Adonai, the awe of God, the fear of God. What does it mean? And soon I'm going to turn this question to you. What would it mean to say, we're going to talk about wisdom, and the beginning of wisdom is the awe of God or the fear of God? But also just notice, as I ask that question, that part of what Proverbs is doing is, at least if we imagine Psalms to be written by David, associated with David, and Proverbs to be written by Solomon, is that you can see Proverbs recording the wisdom of the Psalms. At least that's the way it works in the sort of historical imagination, right? And remember, we're in historical imagination. We are framing this series of classes with a midrash that we looked at last week that imagines that Solomon was young when he wrote Song of Songs and old when he wrote Ecclesiastes. And this is the middle of his life. This is like Solomon having ascended to greatness, he is a man in middle age, right? Like myself. So this beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, is a kind of a tradition that he has been steeped in. So what does it mean? That's a very famous, and in some ways, if we wanted to like stop the class in 5 minutes and we do, what is the main takeaway from the book of Proverbs? Well, the thing that it revolves around a lot is that wisdom is important, and the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. So what does that mean? Anyone want to give us speak out some of what that might mean? I see Alexandra's got a hand up from before, but I don't know if it's yeah, thanks.
It's kind of related to what I was going to say before. I think that the beginning of it makes sense to me that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, and that Musar is an essential part of wisdom for similar reasons, in that Musar I would translate similarly to Florine as the discipline of personal growth or personal transformation. And that, I think, is linked to the fear or awe of God, in that we need to, there's so much throughout like history, throughout culture today and in the past, of those claiming wisdom with arrogance, and that to me is not wisdom. But there's such a danger of, oh, I have wisdom, and with that comes sort of a subtle arrogance that can become really damaging and dangerous, and also take someone off track. So I think that this humble place of acknowledging how much greater God is than me is the place to start seeking and acquiring wisdom, because that humility is essential to maintain wisdom and to stay on the path of wisdom and to grow wisdom.
Okay, beautiful. I think, if I can sort of like hone down even to the core of what you're saying, because I think you struck on something that is very important when we think about the fear of God, the awe of God. However, there's a kind of a submissive, a kind of, and the word I want to use is a kind of humble approach. And I think that's what you were getting at when you spoke about the way that the pursuit of wisdom can be a kind of self-aggrandizing pursuit. I am the wise one. Look at how smart I am. And the more wisdom I acquire, the more brilliant I become, and the greater I become. By the way, this is one of King Solomon's problems, right? But let's leave that aside. What he says is, stay humble, right? That's a part of what it means to say that it starts with the fear of God, is always recognize that there's something higher. Always recognize that your wisdom is great, but it is not. It doesn't exalt you. In fact, it gives you a fuller perspective of your own smallness. Now I'm just elaborating, but I think that theme that Alexandra's raising for us is really critical here. Let's just take one other pass at this from Yael. What do you think, Yael, about the beginning of wisdom being the fear of God?
Well, I really agree with what you and Alexandra were saying, and what strikes me here is that saying that's frequently above the ark, Dalifne miata omed, know before whom, or even we could say before what you stand, that there's holiness in the world. And the path of wisdom is for the purpose of trying to integrate that holiness into your earthly life. And so consequently from that flows the modesty and the tzniut and the larger picture. So yeah,
that's great. Holiness. And let's see, is that what we actually saw here? Let's see here. We're going to see that later, actually. Holy things. But I think you're exactly right. Where did oh, here it is. Beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, and knowledge of holiness is understanding, right? That realm of the holy, it isn't just fear of God, it's just godliness, holiness. Remember that this book is not just, it's referred to sometimes as part of our wisdom literature, right? But it's not just about wisdom. It is, in some ways, it's like an early Maimonides, right? Because it's a little bit like what Maimonides is doing, which is trying to synthesize philosophical, worldly wisdom with our wisdom, the Torah, our religious wisdom. So this is like an attempt to do both, to be like, wisdom is important, but it is religion or God or holiness or whatever, that spiritual realm informs wisdom. So I think that's also an important way of looking at this book. All right, just to give us just a couple of last impressions of the Book of Proverbs before we look at one chapter. It must be noted that the most famous section of the Book of Proverbs is the last one. The Book of Proverbs ends with Eshet Chayil Mimtza, a woman of valor who can find her, right? The song that is traditionally sung on Shabbat evening and is traditionally, like, the idea is like, oh, a husband sings it to his wife because you're such a woman of valor. But we could have picked that as our poetry for the evening. That's a complicated one, and I bet there are people on this Zoom who have thought more deeply about it than I have, so I didn't want to go there, but I wanted to mention that it ends on Eshet Chayil, both because it's famous, but also because it's also true that the Book of Proverbs uses, I don't know exactly how to say this, the image of womanhood or femininity or the she. There's just some woman that is out there, and there are bad women and there are good women, and I'm not saying this is not problematic and, shot through with all kinds of, kind of patriarchal presumptions, but it's also complicated because it isn't really women always that the Book of Proverbs is talking about, because wisdom is also a woman. Wisdom is also spoken of as the she. So it's that woman you want and not it. And Eshet Chayil really, in the context of the book, is about wisdom. But of course, it's more complicated than that. I just wanted, I'm just noting that that's in there because I would not want us to leave without noting that. And then I just have one other much lesser known, but what maybe my favorite line in the book of Proverbs, just like it has these gems, because after all, they're Proverbs. So every line is like a gem, and it has these gems like Lech el nemala atzel, lazy bones, go to the ant, re'eh dracheha v'chacham, study its ways and become wise, right? So it's like, go look at the ant, and you're lazy. If you're lazy, study the ant. Look at how not lazy the ant is. And that's also part of how wisdom is acquired, by observing the natural. So it's like really cool, like, go to the ant, lazy bones. I just love that line. Yeah, so, and there's tons of stuff in here, we'll see some famous lines as we go, but one of the things you get when you read through the Book of Proverbs, and partially because it is so rhythmic, you'll see all these lines that darchea darchei noam, v'chol netiovateha shalom. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all of her paths are peace. From the Book of Proverbs. You'll see again and again these famous phrases in Jewish liturgy that are in the Book of Proverbs, and we'll see one in our chapter. So the chapter we're going to look at tonight is chapter 4 of the Book of Proverbs. And I don't know exactly why I chose this chapter. In some ways, it's because it's representative. It's not, the chapters deal with all kinds of things, but this one's a pretty typical chapter. But in some ways, because what is distinct about it is I said there's no narrative in the Book of Proverbs, but there is some suggestion of narrative. There are in some chapters speakers, and we have to try and figure out who the speakers are, and that's something we've been doing a lot in this class. So let's do that. We'll see. There's a kind of a framework to this chapter that I find particularly tender and beautiful, and so I thought this would be a good way, if you've never seen Proverbs before, to really get to know both the content of the book, but also some of the rhetoric involved, okay? And we're going to spend a lot of time just listening also to the rhythm of the words, because as I said, there's something very syncopated about them. Okay, so let's take a look. We're looking now at chapter 4 of the Book of Proverbs. Okay, I think I'll read a few verses just so you can get I'll read a few verses just so you can get the feeling of the language, but pay attention, and we'll soon talk about who is the speaker, and how is this lesson? We're soon going to hear that it's a lesson. How is it being framed? Okay, all right. So here we go. Verse 1. Shimu banim musar av v'hakshivu ladat bina. Hear, children, a father's discipline. Listen to learn discernment. Ki lekach tov. Right, here's a famous one. Ki lekach tov natati lechem, torati al ta'azovu. For I give you a good lesson. Do not forsake my guidance. Ki ven hayiti la'avi, rach v'yachid lifnei imi. Once I was a son to my father, the tender darling of my mother. Yoreni v'yomar li, yitmach dvarai libecha. Shmor mitzvotai v'chiyeh. He showed me and said to me, let your heart hold on to my words. Keep my commandments and you will live. Kne chochma, kne vina, al tishkach va'al tet mi'imre fi. Acquire wisdom, acquire discernment. Do not forget and do not swerve from my words. Al tazveha v'tishmareka, ehaveha v'titzereka. Do not forsake her, and she will guard you. Love her, and she will protect you. It's like, I hope you hear some of the rhythm there. That's like you might actually call it simplistic poetry. Like, it isn't as sophisticated as the Song of Songs, but there's something kind of like, it works. It's like, and remember this and remember that, and here's a lesson that I'm teaching to you. So, okay, so, and you saw, by the way, in the end there's the her, right? There's that her, remember her, guard her. So we're gonna have to think about what we're guarding, but who's talking here? What is this dialogue? Who is speaking when we open with Shimu Banim, listen children, right? Who's talking here? Michal.
I actually am going to say something else, and I'm very sorry, but I think, especially when it comes to Proverbs, it really has to be listen, my sons, because as much as we want it to be egalitarian, and we can certainly take the lessons in an egalitarian way, the book itself sets up this opposition between the people who are learning and wisdom and the woman so insistently that it seems, at least if we're looking at it from the perspective of the book as a book of poetry, it really is insisting on its gendered nature. And so I think we can take lessons from it that aren't gendered, of course, but I just felt I needed to.
Yeah, it's a very astute comment. I will tell you, I struggled a lot with that choice. And I probably just kind of default to trying to widen the gender when I can, so that it does feel applicable to us all. But I struggled with it, and you're right. There is a kind of the power of Michal's comment is that there's a kind of it's a father speaking about his father talking to his son, and there is a kind of a gendered like. And after all, like his father was the king and he's the king and you're the, if indeed this is Solomon, that there is a kind of like, boys, time to grow up and become, like that is part of what's going on here. So comment very much well taken. Yonatan.
Yeah, I think on the shot level, on the simple literal level, you have King Solomon speaking to his children or to his sons, if we go with the Michal translation. But there's an obvious parallelism being, or I think it's obvious, parallelism being set up between the role of a parent and the role of God in terms of transmitting wisdom.
Good, Yonatan. Can you say more? Where do you see that?
Well, one of the things I want to do is, if you could scroll up, I want to nitpick a little bit at your translation of an earlier verse.
Oh, surprise, surprise.
I know, I just can't resist. So there we go.
No, but go for it, yeah.
It's 9:10, right?
Uh-huh.
And you translated, and a lot of translations do this, knowledge of holiness is understanding, but kedushim without a vav is almost exclusively used to refer to people, holy people, right?
How about that?
Sure, right? But there's a real parallelism right there that says, like, you acquire wisdom, whether you acquire it directly from God or you acquire it from God through this human chain that connects you back to Sinai. And I think that's what the later verses are referring to when they say, don't leave my Torah, right? Like, my Torah, if I'm God, is like, obviously, like, it's my Torah. But also, if you are my child and I practice Torah, that's my Torah too. And like, I want you to have that, right?
Yeah. So I believe that Yonatan is referring to this word right here. Maybe later. I love the maybe later, like maybe later, pal. Ki lekach tov natati lechem, I give you good lesson. And then it says, Torati al ta'azovu. Now, first of all, I want to just go back to this and say, the translation I got here was knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. That seemed weird to me too. So I translated as holiness, but I think you're probably right. That's a better translation, but just to, an aside, my process. But yes, the word here is Torah. And I could have put, do not forsake my Torah. In fact, when we recite this at the Torah service, that is what we're intending. Torati, my Torah, do not forsake, right? And that, I left it as, or I actually translated, I think, as guidance, because it was like instruction or something, because look, that's what Torah means, the guide, the guidance. But Yonatan is absolutely right that there is a very intentional kind of playing with that language where it is, sure, it's wisdom, but it's very much religious wisdom, or religious is maybe the wrong word here, but divine wisdom. And look, by the way, that we saw here, Yoreni v'yomarli, this is a play because Yoreni is the same verb that Torah is formed from. So he showed me, meaning he Torah'd me, and said to me, Yitmach divrei libecha, let your heart hold on to my words, Shmor mitzvotai v'chiyeh, keep my, in this case, we don't even have to fiddle with the translation, it's commandments, mitzvot. So Yonatan's exactly right that these opening lines are a father, and it's a father's discipline. And actually, I want to just say, is it Solomon's sons, or is it just you all children, or you all sons? I don't know. But we are working with then Solomon talking about his own wisdom as a father here, not as a king, but also thinking about his own father because he was a father, and thinking also about his mother. So thinking about David and Bathsheba, right? But with the language of guard my commandments and don't forsake my Torah, it is also, and I think Yonatan's suggesting, and he's quite right, it also becomes God saying to all of us, I am the father, and adopting the role of a tender kind of father. So it's both at once, okay? And in that case, God is talking to, I don't know, Solomon, or to us, or to, Okay, so that's very good work there. Let's see, anyone else? Yael? Oh, no, you just have a hand up from before, right?
No, yeah, it's just from before.
Okay, great. All right, so let's, I see another hand. Joel Katz, are you?
Yeah. So, these terms like chokhmah and bina and all that, and if you think about one of the early prayers in the Amidah, it talks about chokhmah, bina, v'da'at, if you use the Chabad Sidur, or chokhmah, bina, v'haskel, if you use the Ashkenazi Sidur. And I've always wondered about what are the differences between those kinds of knowledge and understanding?
Great. That's a great question. Thanks for that question, Joel, because it's an important question in and of itself, just what are all the, right, what's the old thing, like, Eskimos have a 50 words for snow kind of thing. Like our tradition has like 50 words for chokhmah, right? They were obsessed with that. So lots of different words here, and the major, and let me say, so that is important in itself. And let me say it is important here because of the way biblical poetry works, where the device we've talked about most is parallelism. And so you're going to expect to hear, just like hear and listen are parallel, and discipline and discernment are meant to be parallel. The main couplet that we are going to spend time thinking about is chokhmah and binah, two words there for wisdom, understand. They're often translated as wisdom and understanding. The translation that I got from Safaria here for binah was not understanding but discernment, which comes from a rabbinic explanation of binah, which is that it's to understand bein zeh levein zeh, between something and something else. I don't know if that etymology is correct, but it's like we have a feeling that that's what the word means. Joel's question stands, and I don't have an answer to it. You saw one couplet here, but that is part of what Proverbs is going to do, poetically is going to do, which is to present one idea and then to kind of twist it and present the same idea in a different way. So we've seen that a lot before, but here it will matter because it'll nuance what it means to acquire wisdom. So you acquire wisdom, but you also have to acquire binah, and you also have to acquire musar, and you also have to acquire all of these other forms of development of knowledge. Dat itself is one of the words used. Okay, let's take a look now. I just read a few verses. I want to read just one verse now, because I want to give you, I hope you heard some of the rhythm of Proverbs. I want to give you also a taste of some of these lines are kind of basic, and the message seems very, kind of lofty and maybe moralistic. But some of the lines in Proverbs are so strange that they seem to be meant to make you think. And that would work for the task of the book. And in fact, they're kind of like, there's a way, I think that in the next verse, we get a feeling for the poet of Ecclesiastes, whose statements are not exactly clear, who's sort of like murky and is circular, and you're meant to be a little confused, a little bit more like a Zen koan, actually. So take a look at this. Let's just see if we can even understand what this line means. It sounds beautiful, but it's not so clear to me how to translate it, how to understand it. So let's take a look at verse 7 here. Acquire wisdom, acquire discernment. Here, by the way, is Joel. Here's your couplet for you in one half of a verse. Acquire wisdom, acquire discernment. Right. So both of those things. And speaking of acquisition, the line I want us to look at now is verse 7. Reshit chokhmah kne chokhmah, uvechol kinyonecha kne vina. I would love a translation of this. The beginning of wisdom, and that's the famous phrase. That's the one borrowed from Psalms, Reshit Chokhmah, the beginning of wisdom. What are we supposed to hear now? Is the fear of God. But instead it says something else. Reshit Chokhmah Kne Chokhmah. The beginning of wisdom is, and then switches to the command form, acquire wisdom. And then it says, and with all that you acquire, with all your acquisitions, with all your stuff, with all your possessions, I don't know, acquire binah. So how do we make, what is the proverbist saying here? What does it mean for the beginning of, does it make sense? It's certainly intentional because there's another phrase that should be there, Yirat Adonai, but instead, the beginning of wisdom, acquire wisdom. Payam, what do you think?
To me, it makes sense because there's two ways of knowledge. One is Kant, who has a prioria. So Kant says that people are just inherently born with certain knowledge. So this is saying that the Kantian view of acquiring of knowledge is incorrect. that you're not necessarily born with it, that you have to acquire it, which is like a John Locke version of wisdom. So, I mean, to me, in a philosophical sense, it does make sense to say that the beginning of wisdom is to acquire wisdom. It's saying you're not just born with wisdom. It's something you have to go through a process to attain.
Great, beautiful interpretation. In other words, the language of acquisition is the point. Is in itself a strong statement. Wisdom is something one must work for. Wisdom is something that must be sought. It is not inborn. Some people are just not just born wise or smart, right? You have to seek it. You have to go after it. Emil, what do you think?
Yeah, I confess I was getting a bit frustrated because it seemed so vague. Like, there's that Jack Handy line, I would rather be rich than stupid, and it's like, yeah, be wise. Like, greatness is wonderful, but I guess this line seems to sort of speak to that. And it's just like, it is within you, and like somehow it's an attitude that you can take to go through, like it's like, rather than sort of spending time defining it, he's almost saying like, you can sort of flick a switch and decide that you're going to be thoughtful in life or wise, rather than I don't know, reactive or rather than how he appeared in Song of Songs. You can actually decide to be wise, and then maybe you are wise.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate both that interpretation, but also your expression of frustration, because I think that Emil is expressing, I think, part of what is frustrating. What my friend also, the reason my friend doesn't like the Book of Proverbs, sometimes it feels like, okay, this is Captain Obvious, like, it's just important to be wise and to do the right thing and be wise and do the right thing, so it can be a little tiresome, and it requires us to really, as our tradition has done, to really dig in and be like, wait, but what's that word mean? In other words, in order for this to really be a book of wisdom, you have to assume that it's a book of wisdom. You have to assume that every word is carefully placed, and there is a kind of, every line's a formula that has to be decoded, right? Alexander, what do you think?
I think it's saying that the beginning of wisdom is someone from outside of you, whether that is like the divine voice or just hitting rock bottom and people saying you need to shape up, or someone saying go seek wisdom, needs to tell you to go seek wisdom and you need to choose to do it. I don't think that a human who like doesn't hear that message from somewhere outside themselves in some way is going to seek that. So that's how I interpret it.
Yeah. So, right. So there is a kind of, we can feel throughout the book, and certainly throughout these lines, there's a kind of get up and go, right? Go to the ant, lazy bones, right? Like there's a kind of a gut, you have to go, you have to try, you have to strive, you have like, there's something very, we dealt with this at the outset with Musar being a process of actually engaged self-development. This isn't just going to happen. It's not just meditation. It's not just thinking about the things. You have to live it. You have to act it out. You have to seek it. And there's something very active about the whole thing. All right, let's read a little more. Let's get some more material for our quiver here. Let's see, a few lines here. Okay, this is just beautiful stuff here. Sal saleha utromameka, techabdecha ki techabkena. Hug her to you and she will exalt you. She will bring you honor if you embrace her. Titen leroshcha leviatchen, ateret tiferet timagencha. She will adorn your head with a graceful wreath, secure you with a crown of splendor. Okay, so that's, you can see end quote here. There's going to be a little shift, so maybe I can pause there. But what will wisdom do for you? What is wisdom going to give you? Is a crown. Wisdom will crown you. And on the one hand, it's just poetry, poetic language, just poetry, but it's just a metaphor. But on the other hand, it's like a king talking to a king or a future king. Like if you follow wisdom, you will, right? But how do you do that? How do you get that crown? What is the advice here? Let's go back. Yeah,
I love this. I'm looking at this Sfirot right now, and Chokhmah is on the side of intuition and heart, and Bina is on the side of logic and intellectualism. So you blend together Chokhmah and Bina, and you come out with Da'at. And so it's very interesting because this last paragraph that you read talks about Tiferet, and that's the three that are right below that. Because Chesed, which is compassion, is on the right below Chokhmah, and Gvura, which is, not discipline, but Din, or how do you say that? Din.
Justice, judgment.
Justice, and that Tiferet is between those also. So Tiferet is that glory that comes with the balance between your intuition and your heart and your faith, and the other side, which is your logic and your path of misgeret, your framework, and how you walk in the world. And those together make a beautiful balance in living.
Okay, beautiful. Some of you mystics out there are probably like, oh, I like what I just heard, like the Sfirot, the mystical forces. Oh, there's proof. It's right there. Some of you less mystically inclined are like, wait, what is Yael talking about here? But Yael is offering us one of the classic interpretive modes that is brought to all of our sacred scripture, but particularly to the Book of Proverbs, because Proverbs presents itself as the book of wisdom. So the mystics, and partially for the reason that Joel was asking about earlier, there's so many little terms and there's like separations, and and partially for the reason that I suggested, that the rhythm of the lines is as if like, here is a little formula, figure out what I am saying. Like there's something about, and so it begs for a kind of parsing of every word and like an attempt to find the deep meaning of every word. So what Yael is doing is what the Vilna Gaon does, which is to see everything as like embedded with a kind of a higher code of knowledge, and the mystical forces that God uses to create the world might be one way of reading in that higher code. Okay, so let's see a little more. Because there's a switch now. We've got this. We had this father who might be God, who might be Solomon, who might just be a father, and is giving, I don't know, to his sons, to his children, to all children. But there are these general statements, and then there's this switch. Shema b'ni, as Michal would say, listen, my son, or listen, my child. My child, Shema b'ni v'kach amarai. V'yirbu lecha shnot chayim. My child, hear and take in my words, and you will have many years of life. B'derech chochma horeticha, hidrachticha b'magale yosher. I instruct you in the ways of wisdom. I guide you on straight courses. B'lechtecha lo yetzar tz'adecha, v'im tarutz lo tikashel. You will walk without breaking stride. When you run, you will not stumble. Hachazek b'musar al teref, nitzreha ki hi chayeha. Hold fast to discipline. Do not let go. Keep it. It is your life. Okay. And now things get, so now we've had the shift, like one parent talking to one child, one father talking to one son, and all of this language of path. Right? There's the way, the path of wisdom, the walking, the striding, the not stumbling. Keep going, don't stop going. And then, now that we're thinking about path, we start thinking about the good path and the bad path. So, verse 14 here. Ba'orach rashayim al tavo, va'al ta'asher b'derech ra'im. Do not enter the path of the wicked. Do not walk on the way of evil men. Para'ehu al tavorbo. Shtei me'alav va'avor. Avoid it, do not pass through, turn away from it, pass it by. Ki lo yishnu im lo yireu, v'nigzala shnatam im lo yachshilu. For they cannot sleep unless they have done evil. Unless they make someone fall, they are robbed of sleep. This is a great line. Ki lachamo lechem resha, v'yayin chamasim yishtu. They eat the bread of wickedness and they drink the wine of lawlessness. V'orach tzadikim k'or noga, holech v'or ad nachon hayom. The path of the righteous is like radiant sunlight, ever brightening until the noon. Derech rashayim ka'afela, lo yadu b'meh yikashelu. The way of the wicked is all darkness. They do not know what will make them stumble. Okay, so what's the advice here? You see, like the path, and then there's the path of the wicked and the path of the righteous, and you got to walk the right path. You got to. So this is the central metaphor of this. One of the central metaphors of the book of this chapter is the path. The path. So what's the path, and how do you walk it well? You have time? You have thoughts? And then I'll turn to Ellen after that.
Well, I don't know that this answers your question, but I wish we had more time. I mean, I always wish we had more time because the lessons are great, but maybe like it's worth examining some of these in much greater depth, because this passage is packed with allusions to other parts of scripture, right? And like to really understand it, you need to unpack those allusions. And some of them, like, I have no idea where they're from. I'm just like, oh, I know I've heard something about this before somewhere, right? But like, there's definitely like a lot of meaning that we're supposed to glean just by being familiar with the text in a way that I think like most of us, like including me, just aren't.
That's right. This, after all, is playing on an earlier tradition. This claims to be presenting a tradition, so not surprising that it would allude to earlier thoughts in the tradition. This comes from the book of Ketuvim. So the books of Ketuvim, meaning the last section of the Bible. And there's this way in which, like, the last section of the Bible, the Psalms, the Proverbs, is a little bit of like a kind of a reckoning or a midrash or reforming or rethinking of the first sections of the Bible. And I will tell you, I said earlier, the rabbis love Proverbs. In general, the rabbis tend to love the books in Ketuvim more than they like the books of the prophets. I'm not crazy about the prophets because that's not their model. What they like is the wisdom literature, because the wisdom literature does what the rabbis do, which is to study the books, the words, and then to kind of play with them, to reformulate them, right? So there's a lot of that going on. Ellen, what were you going to say?
I feel like my remarks are very humble compared to a lot of people who have already spoken. But it seems to me that this idea of acquiring wisdom is, first of all, you have to be aware that there is wisdom, and that puts you on a path to observing what happens in your life, what happens to other people, and also on a path to not act rashly, to think before you do things, and that you truly are headed down a path of life. So you have to set your compass in the way that you're going. You can follow after people who do bad things. It's very easy to be tempted to do those things. It's only wisdom that teaches us that think about this a little bit before you do it. What are the consequences of this before you do it?
No, I think those comments are not humble at all. Those take us right straight into the heart of this central metaphor, this path. There's this path. You walk down the path, and you got to be careful as you go down the path. I mean, it really is like hiking. It's like being on a journey. It's like you must think. Every step you take, you must think. And the journey is life. The journey is life. And throughout life, you'll have to ask yourself where am I going? And there's always the path of wickedness. That's there. You can always take it. So you have to think. It's like the fork in the path is at every step. You keep taking the fork and keep taking the fork, and it could go wrong at any point. There is a kind of, I think my friend doesn't like this about the book, there's a kind of like heaviness to it. You really have to be so thoughtful here, so deliberate, right, as you walk down this path. Hannah, what do you think?
I was just thinking about the fact that sometimes I think we actually gain the most wisdom when we fall off the path. And so I'm wondering about how do we understand that? Because if we're so focused on staying on the right path, doing the right things, blah, 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 that's fine. But we all fall off the path. We just do. Maybe there's some separation between falling off the path or a little bit off the path and still staying away from an evil path. But I think there's no way that we actually stay on this straight and narrow, and that so much of our growth happens when we fall short or we swerve somewhere or we end up maybe tempted by the evil path, and then we're reminded of what we want to come back to. But it seems like part of wisdom is experience, and a lot of that experience has to be flawed and has to be kind of messy. And so I'm just wondering about the space for that messiness to then lead us back to wisdom and eventually end up on that path, but that it can't, if we never see anything else, we don't know that that's the right path.
Great. That's so helpful. Words of wisdom, Hannah. So helpful. And I think this, first of all, it is a problem with the book, right? You're going to hear again and again, don't fail, don't fall, don't step off the path. Right? It's almost like there's something very severe about, very unforgiving about the Book of Proverbs. And I think that that's especially helpful because remember, we are thinking of this, we are using that midrash we studied last week to think of this as the book that describes Solomon in at the height of his powers, in full confidence. He is the wise king who tells women to cut their babies in half, only to show that, haha, I was smarter than you and you would never. There's a kind of like a almost terrifying confidence that Shlomo is bringing to this, that we know Shlomo to have had from the stories of him, and that it really does feel like that's the tone of this book. So I think it is something to be mindful of, to be watching. There isn't a lot of room for error here. On the other hand, I will say this as a response to Hannah's question, maybe the acknowledgement of our failures is precisely in the repetition of the book. That is, Shlomo does feel like he has to say it again and again and again and again because it's not easy. These are simple lessons, but to actually integrate them is not simple at all. And as an illustration of that, let's take a look at some of the last lines here, because this is also a kind of a repetition. Shlomo begins again, my child, my son, again. And here we'll read, like, I think we can hear in response to Hannah's concern, a little bit of a like, I know it's hard. I know that it's not easy, but keep going, keep going, keep going. And we're going to land on the whole reason that I brought this chapter to you tonight is for verse 23. Verse 23 is one of the most superb lines in all of Tanakh. So let's maybe end with that tonight. So let's see here. We'll start on verse 20. Okay, here again, Bni, my child. Lidvarai hakshiva, la'amarai hatoznecha. My child, listen to my speech. Incline your ear to my words. Al yalizu meinecha, shomrim betoch levavecha. Do not lose sight of them. Keep them in your heart. Ki chayim hem lemotzehem, lechol basaro marpeh. They are a life to him who finds them, healing for his whole body. mikol mishmar netzor libecha, ki mimeno totzot chayim. More than all you guard your heart, for from it comes forth life. I mean, that line, oh, that line. More than all you guard your heart. And I must say, it's especially beautiful if you translate it as heart, but the translation on Sefaria, if you go look at it, is actually mind. And that's because the word lev in ancient Hebrew is mind and heart. It's the consciousness, the inner self, right? So more than all you guard your mind, guard your heart, for from it comes forth life, right? So there is a kind of, yes, it's severe, and yes, it's intense, and yes, there's something, but there is a tenderness to it. There is a kind of a father speaking to his son, feel like, I implore you, just be careful. And more than anything, be careful of your heart. Guard your heart. Trust your heart. Follow your heart, your mind. Cultivate your mind, right? That's the essence, right? Everything else is a distraction. All right, we got to wrap up soon, but I see one hand in the air. Let me give Payam the last comment.
I want to go back to voice and who's speaking with whom. To me, this really sounds like Solomon speaking to himself. It's the wisdom of an older man talking to a younger man who's done all the things that he's done. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the preachiness comes from, because the words he uses and the tone of his voice is the voice we all use when we speak to each other, to ourselves, when we discipline ourselves. It's our inner voice.
I love that. Payam. We had that question last time, right? I mean, we're imagining, that Solomon is the author of these books. Tradition says so. And then we're adding to that an imagination that Solomon, one, represents early, middle, and later phases of his life. I think it's just a beautiful way to read these books. But we talked last week about whether to think of the Song of Songs as written when Solomon was young or written when Solomon was old, reflecting back on what it meant to be young. And that's a beautiful way to think about this book also, is that maybe this is the older Solomon thinking, man, when I was king, when I was wise, when I knew it all, right? And then there were things I didn't know and things I actually had to, because Solomon, let's not forget, we said last time, veers wildly off the path of righteousness, right? Solomon ruined everything, worshiped foreign gods, did not follow the commandments. So yes, on the one hand, you got to do the right thing. You got to stay on the path. But on the other hand, because none of us really do it, right? None of us stay on the path. All right. Emil, we'll give you the last comment.
Can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
What's so wrong with our hearts? Why is this good advice? Most songs are listen to your heart, right? That's what resonates with us. So why is this wise?
You mean,
or what is he talking about? What is the thing in our hearts that is so bad that we must
I wasn't reading it that way. I was reading it your heart is good and you have to take care of it. You have to protect it. Yeah, or your mind, your consciousness has to be safeguarded. That's the center of your being. I don't know. Do anyone else want to respond to this? I do think this is one of the most beautiful lines. So, Michal, you've got a thought?
Yeah, I'm the usual downer, but you can read it completely in the opposite way.
No, but what do you think?
You can read it in completely the opposite way, which is you have to guard your heart because it's so vulnerable to all the wickedness, and we are inherently weak, and therefore heart, mind, consciousness, whatever you want to say. And so guard is really put up a guard and don't let anything in other than this very narrow vision of Musar that I am giving you.
Yeah.
So it's not the same reading.
Which I have not done myself.
Right.
Solomon, right? Yeah.
That's fair. I think that's a fair reading. You have to be careful of your heart and of the things that might invade your heart and how weak you are in the face of the temptations of your heart. Totally fair reading. But remember, because life comes from your heart. Life comes from
Exactly. So you got to make sure that you don't let anything that's going to be dangerous.
All I'm saying is that there's also something celebratory about it, something sacred about something. There is a reverence for the heart, even as there's an extreme caution around it. All right, that's probably all the time we have for tonight. I will just say, we'll read the end of the last few lines here. And I am, as I said, I'm very conscious of today being Inauguration Day. And I don't have enough wisdom to directly comment on it and turn to our senior rabbi for that. But I will say these last lines, I think, it will serve as a fair blessing for the next king of this land. So let's offer our future leadership these last words, because I think we could use them at this after this long journey. Haser mimcha ikshut peh, ulezut sfatayim harchek mimeka. Put crooked speech away from you. Keep devious talk far from you. Einecha lenochach yabitu, v'afapecha yashiru negdecha. Let your eyes look forward, your eyelids straight ahead. Pales ma'agal raglecha, v'chol drachecha yikonu. Survey the course of your feet, and all your paths will be steady. Al tet yamin usmol, haser raglecha mira. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Keep your feet from evil. You know, that is the wisdom of a king who was not always able to follow that advice, as Payam reminds us. So it's a wisdom hard won, and I certainly hope that we have through this hardship, that we have won some wisdom, and that our leadership has won some wisdom, and that the next era in our national life will be carried out with wisdom. May it be so. Thanks, everybody. Next week, Ecclesiastes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for your Torah tonight.
Cheers, Bru'im. Be healthy.
Thanks.
Be well, everyone. Be healthy.
Healthy.
Happy Inauguration Day.
Yay!
Bye, all. All right.